Welcome to Faith and Freedom. For the next few minutes, we hope to inform, inspire, and encourage you as we discuss the legal victories and challenges to your fundamental freedoms and religious liberties. Faith and Freedom comes to you from Liberty Counsel, a civil liberties education and legal defense organization. Join us now as Matt Staver, the President and General Counsel of Liberty Counsel, explains the latest legal issues all across this country in the courtrooms of America. Liberty Counsel is winning the battle for your constitutional freedoms.
Liberty Counsel joins a coalition to defend the National Day of Prayer. I'm Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel and dean of Liberty University School of Law. Joining me is Matt Barber, director of cultural affairs for Liberty Counsel and associate dean for the law school. This National Day of Prayer case is something that was brought by the Freedom from Religion Foundation in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a very radical, liberal organization that is very anti-Christian in all of its makeup, headed by a couple of atheists that are husband and wife. And they filed suit. Barbara Crabb, a judge in Madison, ultimately struck down the National Day of Prayer, saying that it was unconstitutional, the legislation that authorized this National Day of Prayer. Liberty Counsel has now joined with Liberty Institute, Focus on the Family Action, the Family Research Council, and others in a friend of the court brief, an amicus brief, where we have filed now at the Court of Appeals to uphold this law, the National Day of Prayer.
Well, and I think one phrase particularly from the brief is particularly telling, and it is evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt that this this ruling by Judge Crabb is absurd. And I'm going to read it here. It says, quote, "The first Congress called for the president to declare a national day of thanksgiving and prayer the same day as it finalized the language of the First Amendment itself. There was no conflict between the two actions in the minds of the framers. To determine otherwise would be to indict the founders as unable to understand their handiwork, or worse, hypocrites about it in the extreme. That is so telling to me that on the same day that the language of the First Amendment was finalized, the first Congress called for the president to declare a national day of prayer. And now this judge and this group and others on the left who wish to recreate in America and their own secular humanist self-image have the audacity to say that this is somehow unconstitutional. It just doesn't track with reality.
Yeah, no question about it. And in fact, the brief also points out that when Congress calling in this National Day of Prayer legislation on us to acknowledge God on that day is just one of many instances where we have historical documents that do the same thing. In fact, the Declaration of Independence says that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and they plead to God to intervene. And that's our birth certificate, the American birth certificate. The Star-Spangled Banner and presidential and congressional proclamations on Thanksgiving and Christmas, they all do the same thing, call upon us to acknowledge God. That's been something that we've done from the very beginning. In fact, at the very first event where you had people coming together to debate the Constitution, it was Benjamin Franklin who called upon those people when it was time to do so, at the point in time when it was falling apart, to step back a few moments and let's pray. So they prayed, but not just for a few moments, for 3 days. They went to a prayer meeting. From that moment on, every time we've had a session of Congress, we have taken a moment to pause and ask God for his intervention.
Think about that for a minute, Matt. This is the same Ben Franklin that the left loves to tout as a a big proponent of separation of church and state. This language that is found nowhere in the Constitution, which of course was in a letter to the Danbury Baptists by Thomas Jefferson, reassuring the Danbury Baptists simply that the state would not interfere in the rights of the church, that there would be a wall of separation between church and state, protecting the church from the state, and essentially telling them that there would not be an official establishment of a state religion like there was in Great Britain with the Anglican Church. And of course, that's what the clear language of the United States Constitution is addressing in the Establishment Clause, saying that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, of a state religion. That's it. That's the extent of it. So the fact that the very inception of the Constitution would not have occurred but for
prayer.
Benjamin Franklin calling for 3 days of prayer and fasting, and but for prayer, we would not even be a nation today.
I know, it's amazing. It's at the very foundation, the cornerstone of this country is prayer, asking God to intervene. Because there were some of the founders at that constitutional convention in Philadelphia after the revolution, where they're trying to debate what kind of form of government are we going to be, that were so discouraged because for as many yeas there were nays. They could not get consensus on anything. Some of them were actually in the process of leaving because they felt it was no point. Others pleaded with them to just stay for a moment. Franklin then stood up and said, "Have we forgotten our powerful friend, or do we think that we no longer need his assistance?"
Right.
And he goes on to this great eloquent message, calls on them to pray. They prayed. 3 days later, they came back and reconvened, and the Constitution 3 weeks later was birthed, and America was born. And that's why we have prayer every single time that we have our legislative sessions. The National Day of Prayer is like the president's proclamations, because the presidents have historically, from Washington to the present, have had a Thanksgiving Day proclamation or Christmas proclamation in which they ask for God's intervention and guidance. We have had national days of prayer, and this is just one time where we have legislation that says let's have a national day of prayer set aside.
Well,
and now this judge to say that that's unconstitutional, if it's unconstitutional, then the Constitution itself is unconstitutional, because these days of prayer predated the Constitution.